I'm aware that you have a very specific background. Um, and while many artists, when asked the question, why did you become an artist? They have any number of reasons that can be quite circumstantial around growing up or something like that. But in your case, quite specifically, certainly the circumstances must be that your grandmother was Parasceva Clark and that both your parents are architects. So I suppose you could say architect or artist. When did you decide to become an artist instead of an architect?
I did apply to both things when I finished high school. And, in being interviewed about architecture by one of the universities, I liked, or at least I presented myself as liking the kind of constraints within the creative process that architecture would present as a challenge for me. And yet I did choose art in the end, and perhaps it was because I recognized that I could construct my own rules in the art world. And I think my parents were relieved that I chose art over architecture. But I was in a fortunate position, for sure, I thought, where going to art school was not something that was questioned as being a fruitless pursuit by my family, and certainly my parents recognized that there was a lot for me to learn in art school, and I think that, and even though my mother's mother was not a career artist, she was very creative as well, and at quite a young age I asked her about her life and was she afraid to die, and she said she wasn't, and she'd lived much longer than she ever thought she would, and then she went on to talk to me about how beautiful hands are, and what an amazing gift it is to have hands, and that never left my memory. So I grew up in an environment where things were being made all the time. And it wasn't just so-called art, but, the towel rack in the kitchen and the Christmas cards, and it was a pretty do-it-yourself household. Lots of graph paper, lots of, measuring of things. And so all of it filtered in. Mm-hmm.
When I think about this question of architect or artist, I'm aware that from my own background, that architects don't necessarily find themselves in a hands-on situation. They conceptualize and they produce, but they don't actually have to make, and artists make for the most part. Is that one of the... If one asks the question, what can an artist do, or what does an artist do, is it the making that you found most attractive, or made the decision for you?
Certainly I think that art making has a more immediate relationship to the material world. It seemed to me that in architecture there's a lot of planning, and yes, ultimately one can build one's own house. However, in the profession, you would be typically hiring someone else to build the work, and the art that I've made that has been built by others has certainly presented its challenges. Of course, that all depends on who is hired to build, say, a public artwork, something that's integrated into the fabric of a building. But it is difficult to grapple with that arm's length relationship to making. And it seemed to me somehow that architecture was, clearly just more involved, that there's a kind of infrastructure, that there are a lot of rules. And certainly from what I'd seen from my parents' experience, also not necessarily always the most idyllic clients to work for. So you're really ultimately, unless it's your own home, pursuing someone else's idea for the most part of what they would like to see in the world. And art somehow just seemed more interesting than that.
Mm. I'm interested by the fact that so much of your practice has involved public works, working with perhaps architects, certainly working with clients. So in some respects, as an artist, you seem to float between these two environments. Would that be true?
I have. I've been through a period of time when I've done, I think at one point I did count the number of projects that I'd applied for and the number that I'd actually been chosen to make. I think there may be a dozen or so public art pieces out in the world at this point. And certainly the public art making has occupied a fair amount of my mental space, because the two projects that I'm currently waiting to be completed, I started in 2009, so we're on year number 8. But the things which I was able to do in public art making were of such a different context than the making that I did for my personal practice for galleries or museums, that I think at this point I'm at a point where I'm ready to take a break from the public art realm for a while. I don't know if it's a final decision, but at the moment certainly there's something really lovely about making things which go out into the world and stay out in the world, and that you can drive by and see, and that are just integrated into our environment, and that's been really gratifying with public art making. That's been a good aspect of public art making, I think. But at the moment, my head is not in public art making, I have to say.
How useful is art? And when I think about this question of public commissions, of course, this does travel somewhat the same terrain as an architect.
Mm-hmm.
You're producing something that becomes part of a built environment. And the built environment is what, of course, basically constitutes the city. Consequently, extremely useful. But if we retire from the public work back into the studio, let's say, then that question takes on more urgency.
Mm.
So then the question becomes, well, what can an artist contribute? What can an artist do? What does an artist do against this background of socially useful production? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I think that artists that I've spoken with, and certainly I've found that when we walk out in the world, we see a plethora of art. Certainly if we start going to galleries and art fairs, and it can be quite paralyzing to see how much art is made, and why should we make more? What purpose does art serve? And I at times even imagined trying to not make art, and I was warned against it. I was kind of warned that probably would not serve me well, that would serve my health well. And so, I think it's something that claims us in a way that, we can't say necessarily in the moment what the justification is for doing such a thing and devoting the time and attention to the pursuit of making art. However, it does seem that we need people in the world who witness a time and a place in a way that exists outside of business and outside of day-to-day necessity, and that art making is a place where things can show up that otherwise would go into hiding in the context of our society now. I've kind of lamented at times that art exists in the sense that it needs its own word and its own place to be shown, and that it kind of lamented that well, it wasn't the day, but when a time came historically that art was separated from day-to-day life, and but I also see the value in allowing for it, leaving a space or allowing a place in society for things to be made simply for the sake of making them, and the freedom of expression that comes with that, and what we can learn from seeing those things, how we can be fed or what can be fed by that making. And I don't think that those things are always even intentional or graspable. I don't think those things are always known at the time that something's made by anyone, even the people looking at what's been made. So I try to take heart in that.
It's been suggested that if one were to look at your work, broadly speaking, Panya, that, and this seems a little bit reductivist, but I'd be interested in your exploring it, that your interest lies in investigating the mechanisms of cultural representation and their influence on us as a society. So perhaps this gets back to what an artist can do. Would you agree with that? Or?
I think I have to. I really need to preface, in a way, many of my answers today, because I'm hopefully, I'm at a kind of midway point in the sort of the arc of my practice, and I certainly sense a kind of moment of reversal, perhaps, or a rewind almost, where the first part of my practice was very much about trying to overcome the distance between myself and the world represented to me in images, in kind of this cornucopia of mediated ways in the world, and really trying to make meaning of and from worlds that were apart from me or at a distance. And, you know, in that was a kind of critique, I think, of really a wondering of what had been lost really over time in our relationship to the world as a result of photography, as a result of film or media. And so I can see now, like, a whole series of works that I've made that have examined these things, whether it's National Geographic magazine or the institution at the museum, and a kind of critique around collecting and objects and meanings and how we make meaning, and trying to kind of wade my way through, I think, just like a plethora of choices that we have, that certainly in the first decade after leaving art school, I felt very, intrigued and also troubled by what I was committed to in life and as a maker, what meant something to me, and trying to construct meaning for myself. I've had moments in the last couple of years where I've thought, well, a lot of that was about materializing things, and now I almost feel as though I want to dematerialize or reverse that impulse. I think I've been pretty troubled over the years by the whole mechanism of art making and viewing. And I've in various ways tried to overcome that distance. My last major installation, Lost in the Wood, constructed, it was a sculpture but also a physical or a functional dining space that groups of people could occupy and employ as a space to gather in, to celebrate or discuss or tattoo one another. All kinds of things happened in Lost in the Wood. So that was an experiment with trying to activate the gallery space in a way that could bring my sort of life and social life into my work. But at the moment, I have to say, I'm with the things that I'm currently making, I question whether I would show them in a traditional gallery context. That I'm not sure that it serves the work, I guess.
Serves the practice.
It serves the actual pieces,
Yeah.
the actual, yeah.
Well, that's interesting because, of course, we're here in your house rather than the studio. And one of the reasons for that is that precisely what you've just been saying, that you feel there's an element in your, and I'm going to call it your practice, your practice, and it's an expanded field, if you want, that finds the public space, the gallery, somehow seems inappropriate to the productions in this space. I'm kind of curious about that. Is it a sense of privacy, or?
you know, there's a real, one of the things that I've thought about in the last number of years is the idea that we have about, well, a number of things. The ideas that we have about the sort of genius of the artist, about the hero, this solo hero's journey idea, or and I guess I've come to really wonder, you know, when an idea comes to my mind, where is that idea coming from? Why do I think of covering a teacup and saucer with rawhide? Where did that idea come from? You know, certainly there's a kind of there's a kind of mystery, really, to how things play out, that I see now that I recognize the importance of allowing that to show up, and somehow it's not that, like, there is a part of my practice where I specifically do kind of carve out a very individual space, but the truth of my life is that I live in relationship to a number of people who are very close to me, my husband, my 2 daughters, my extended family, and that art making can be a very lonely place to be. And, you know, if I can give something or make something for someone that actually connects or relates directly with what they are doing or an experience they're having, that feeds more than my individual life. And it's that to me is like just a huge, like, it's just a huge gift. The things that show up, you know, so it's just, you know, life has its way with you, and that has its you know, its hardships and its struggles, but it's also just can be a huge gift. And I realized that when we talked earlier, you know, about my grandmother's work and this idea of this sort of double faith that goes back into Russian history, and certainly lived, you know, she was a peasant, a Russian peasant living in Rosedale. You know, she was you know, a woman who was close to the earth but had been raised in sort of Orthodox Catholicism and knew the Bible, and, you know, and all of these things, these contradictions lived in her life. And I see more and more as I get older that these kind of contradictions live in my own life. But I think this is where, you know, I've heard it said that, you know, that when you have 2 things that are against each other, the way that they move against each other is where the holy shows up. And the holy was never something that was ever spoken of, because in my life, in my upbringing, because there was a rejection of so-called religion, and I'm not saying that that's religion, but I'm saying that what is it that just is magical and mysterious? Life is mysterious. And as I see that more, it's like, well, why would I exclude making cheese or having a deer come down the Humber River and get killed on the highway here, and having my husband bring that deer home and leave it in the garage for me to take care of while he's away on business? You know, I mean, it was a day where I woke up and I was like kind of depressed, quite frankly. My kids were young, it was a hard time in my life, and all of a sudden I'm like, what are you talking about? There's a dead deer in my garage. You know, but by the end of the day, the urgency of that deer being in my driveway meant that I, 10 days later, had like naturally tanned a deer hide. I don't know. Life is strange at times, but I can't seem to, and I see more and more, why would I want to separate what I do when I'm alone from what I do when I'm with my family or when I'm with other people? And both those things have to exist for me to live fully.
How do you see the relationship between material, material being, if you want, and idea, ideas being something that one associates with the public?
Oh, that's a complicated question. I don't necessarily see that what I make in the studio is for the public, or that what I make at home isn't for the public. And I'm not sure I can the relationship between ideas and materials, I don't know how I can map that really. Certainly, I recognize that my ideas change quickly, and I think one of the frustrations or challenges as an artist, for me anyway, is keeping up with the ideas, because physical manifestation takes time, and ideas can flash through me or us, and if ideas aren't manifested within a certain time frame, they seem to, for the most part, lose their potency or relevance somehow. And so, I mean, some of the work here in the studio is an attempt, at least with the drawings. I really only started drawing 2 years ago as part of my, as finished works in my practice as an artist. I certainly did lots of drawings where I was figuring things out, dimensions and so on. But I began drawing a couple of years ago, and part of what attracted me to drawing was the potential for ideas to move more quickly and works to be less materially burdensome. And yet I didn't want to leave the world of sculpture. So I invented a rule for myself which would allow my sculptures to become so thin that they would be perceived as drawings. And I could explore ideas about volume that were about actual volume of material with it being actually somewhat immeasurable ultimately. So that was a really nice playful way to kind of bring material into a flow with ideas. Over the last few years, I've been really inspired by Andrea Zatel's practice. I've been to her encampment twice now in Southern California. There are aspects of her practice which I'm uncomfortable with, but I like her capacity to make her life an investigation and flow back and forth between the gallery setting and the home setting. And she's a remarkable woman. She's, I really admire her practice. Certainly recently, seeing Agnes Martin's exhibition in Los Angeles and looking at some of the drawings of Eva Hesse, and there's been a kind of desire or a longing to pay homage to some of these women artists. I mean, those are artists who have gained huge recognition in the art world already, and I think about what other artists there may be that I discover over the coming years who inspire me, or who I want to remember in my work. And that's come up for me in the last little while. I took my mother to Walter de Maria's Lightning Field for her 80th birthday, and that was a fabulous experience. Yeah, and one of the things that I read in the Dia Foundation book when we went to the site was, it kind of reworked into this drawing: the sum of the facts does not constitute the work or determine its aesthetic. And something caught my attention about that, about how we can take the same facts could apply, to a number of different circumstances, but that never fully determines what the meaning of the work is. And there's something in that mystery I was talking about in that for me, that's the inexplicable aspect. Yeah, there seems to be an appreciation or a gratitude in the days that we're living in now, from what I see, from where I stand, for circumstances in which people can gather and find ways to really be human with each other. That somehow it just doesn't, I don't know, it just, I was going to say it doesn't seem to occur in the institutions of art, but I don't really know that. I'm partly sort of, there was a part of me that for a long time felt that really, the museum and the gallery were places for things to go and die. That as soon as it was in there, the work was in there, it was no longer living in the world. But I did read an essay recently that was written by Louis Jacob. Can't remember the title. It's in his catalog on Seeing and Believing. And he makes a pretty interesting argument for the value and the purpose of the museum that I really appreciated reading, because it kind of rekindled my curiosity about what it is that is possible in the museum, and that having a distance that one needs to overcome to find this kind of life force between oneself and this world, this physical world around us, or these objects that are made for us to look at, that kind of unpredictability of that gap being sort of straddled, was that it was important that that gap be there, that we had to kind of poke our heads through this hole and kind of look around on the other side and make some decision about whether we connected or liked something, and that the museum gave us an opportunity to do that. And that kind of rekindled a bit of my desire to, or because it's not always, I can't say, oh, I don't like museums. I feel absolutely comfortable in museums on one level, in some ways, right? So this is where the contradictions bump up against each other.
How do you imagine the public?
A lot of my public, you're using the word public again, and I guess Lost in the Wood really, it was available to the public. Anyone could book time in the space, and although most people that did had a personal connection, although some just called up the gallery and said, yeah, we'd like to come in. A lot of those works seem to be about optics and about constructing something that emphasized or drew attention to how constructed our environment is. And so on the one hand, I guess I want there to be a playfulness in that for the public, and then a kind of just heightened awareness of the physical space that one's moving through. And I think ultimately a recognition that things look a certain way from where we stand in the world. And when we just move to the left or to the right, things look different. And I guess fundamentally in those very public works, that's been a topic that I think can stand a kind of test of time, that this is not something that has to do with the politics of the day, but that 50 years from now we'll still be kind of intrigued by how our vision works and what dimensionality is, and the relationship between physicalness and movement. I think I'm happy to have people find delight in my work if they do. I think that even though I've had times when a kind of darker, more troubled kind of grappling, has sat with me for a long period of time. I think in the end, I'm not really interested in my work being about that. I guess ultimately I want the work to be life-giving and it seems in a way that there's a kind of sacredness to the work that I think would be, I just don't think it would be that respectful to the work in the end, from my view, to not take those opportunities to make something delightful. There are many things that we put in place, as human beings to kind of prevent touching. And I'm not really talking about physical touching, but could be that, but to kind of, in a way, not have to see the real thing. And somehow it seems to be connected to fears that we have. And so I think part of the work, part of the exploration is to take those filters away, or to try to see what is really there. And maybe this is the difference perhaps with the first part of the arc I was talking about, which was I was choosing what I wanted to be looking at more closely. And perhaps so-called authenticity is coming at me from behind, because it seems that somehow I'm being called on to look at things that I don't really necessarily want to see. But when I get past my kind of initial discomfort, it's pretty rewarding, right? And maybe it's that sense of urgency that, when my mother-in-law was dying, or when this deer ended up in my garage, or when I saw that something was going to be kind of disregarded or cast aside, I guess a kind of determination to actually honor those things that are in our pathway. They seem to be trying to teach me not to be afraid, right? And somehow in that there is an authenticity.